Welcome. Welcome to week 4 of Mpai 600 here at Georgetown University's School of Continuing Studies Applied Intelligence. I want to just start off with a couple of announcements. Our next Zoom session is February 9th. That's Sunday, February 9th. So groups 1, 2, and 3 will brief the assignment 2, and I've just released that so you can see what that actual assignment is. Groups 4, 5, and 6 on February 9th, your paper is due at 11:59 that night. So groups 1, 2, and 3 will be doing group presentation. 4, 5, and 6 will be doing a paper, and then the following Zoom session will be flip-flop. Start thinking about the papers. Again, I released it, so the paper is related to the case studies that we've talked about so far, the confessions, Pearl Harbor, Yom Kippur War, and then the two case studies you have this week. Everyone has their paper 1 overview back to them. I think most people did well. Some people really hit it out of the park. Just some issues I saw. Some of the requirements were too broad. Almost everyone had requirements that were way too broad. Narrow it down further. You have to attach a collection asset to a requirement. Where are drug cartels smuggling over the southern border is far too broad for a collection asset or an area of interest to be established. Narrow them down as much as you can. Do the research behind it and be able to actually focus your requirements. And again, terrorist attack threat in the city, way too broad. Better one. Does ISIS use Telegram to attract men 8 to 25 years old in East Nashville? That is more that you can collect on rather than, is there a threat in whatever city you guys are talking about? A lot of you put the intel requirements before the horse. A couple of people did this. Can SIGINT be used to solve opioid problems in my county? You want to ask the question first. How do we decrease, or is there an opioid problem in North San Francisco for people between the ages of 18 and 25? Then you can analyze what collection system would be best to go after that. And something like opioids, you really wouldn't use SIGINT. You just use kind of open source information that's already out there, looking at prescriptions and other types of publicly available data. Social media exploitation. I didn't talk about this, and maybe I should have, and maybe I'll do that for next classes, but social media is good in some cases. If you're assessing Russia influence operations in Europe, if you're assessing Russian operations in the Ukraine, social media has been used well to exploit or to pull information. It won't work in some cases. Obviously North Korea, because they don't have Facebook or Twitter out there. MS-13 is a gang that doesn't use online radicalization. It uses actual person-to-person radicalization, more the traditional norm. So social media is good, but it could be, it's not a panacea for everything. And then the final thing I'll say is a lot of people have prior Intel experience. I run through this every semester. Try and limit the intelligence jargon as much as possible. You want to have some, because you're talking about Intel collection assets and those types of issues, but you want to write this so a policymaker or someone who might not be a congressional staffer understands where you're going with what you're trying to do. Don't write it so technical that it can't be read. And I would also recommend everyone use the Writing Center. It's there on campus. You're paying for it one way or another, and it's a resource that everyone should utilize in this program. So week 3 review. 2 case studies, Pearl Harbor and Yom Kippur War. So the Pearl Harbor, the DAL looked at it from kind of these 3 cases, or these 3 schools of thought regarding intelligence failure. There's the traditional school that there was too much information, that the analysts got overwhelmed, and they couldn't sift through all the data coming through, and that's why the Pearl Harbor failure happened. And you can make that same argument with 9/11. There's the reformist school, which argues that the intel boxes, so to speak, weren't properly arranged. The right people weren't talking to the right, or weren't collecting the data and giving it to the people that can actually make the decisions. You'll see this in the Pearl Harbor case study, where information was collected at national level databases that might have stopped the 9/11 attack, but because of bureaucracy and because of chain of command, that information was not disseminated down to the FBI or the police departments that could have actually made decisions, whether surveillance or arrests, that would have broken up the 9/11 plot. Same thing in Pearl Harbor. Information was collected at the federal level, but it was not disseminated down to military commanders for bureaucratic and chain of command reasons. Then there's the contrarian school, which focuses on the collection assets, that this is kind of a little bit of the opposite of the traditional. They said that there wasn't enough collection assets and capabilities out there, and that's why you had Pearl Harbor or 9/11 or any of the other intelligence failures that we discussed. So these are kind of the three schools of thought. You can almost, for Pearl Harbor, borrow from each one of them to determine what was the primary failure that caused the Pearl Harbor. Dahl brings up a better case study, and he uses the Pearl Harbor and the Midway cases to illustrate themselves. And he said the problem isn't one of these three schools. It's at the interface with the policymaker and the intelligence analyst. That the intelligence wasn't communicated with specific tactical information so that policymakers, the military leaders in this case, could act on it. That's why Midway, they were able to act on it. They got specific data. And I just saw the movie Midway, and they talk about this in a little bit more detail, but the intelligence was specific enough to act, while in Pearl Harbor it was so vague that the commanders ignore it. I like Dahl. I like the book. That's why I sign it. I think it's a very clear look at intelligence failure, but I don't necessarily agree with his analysis in this case. And the reason being is that you will never get specific data, particularly when it comes to these surprise attacks. Nowhere is someone going to say there's 19 hijackers in the United States. They're going to board these 4 planes at this time and target these buildings. That doesn't happen. For those of you who've deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan and dealt with IEDs and the threat of IEDs, no one ever gets the report that says there's going to be an IED at this 10-digit grid location, this specific location, at this time, targeting this convoy. That does not happen in the real world. And that brings me to kind of my last school. I call it the Sharma School. It's not really the Sharma School. It's basic use of intel to provide risk reduction, reasonable risk reduction countermeasures. To go back to that IED problem, you're not going to be able to say, when and where the specific IED is going to happen, but you can give enough intelligence, timing, which is the most hazardous, where the general location of IEDs are, general times that IEDs are in place, that specific risk reduction measures, reasonable risk reduction measures, can be employed. So for that IED, it's make sure your jammer's on, make sure that the convoy going out is your most experienced convoy commander, inform, drive slower. These are some reasonable countermeasures that you could do to avoid that IED. And if that IED doesn't go off, no worries, because the countermeasures were reasonable. To use the 9/11 case study, there was, and you'll see this in several of the documentaries, there was data that there could be a threat to U.S. commercial aviation, that they could be used like a Tomahawk missile. You didn't get the specific information, but there was enough data out there. And you could have implemented reasonable risk reduction measures. You can put reinforced cockpit doors. You can make sure the crew is trained. Hell, you could put the drink cart, for those of you who fly now, the drink cart is placed in front of the cockpit when it's not being used, so no one could storm the cockpit. If that had been employed in 20%, 30% of airplanes, that simple countermeasure, no 9/11. And there's no real drawback to not doing that. So again, there's the intelligence has to be specific enough so reasonable risk reduction measures can be employed. And I argue in the Pearl Harbor, and I brought this up in my lecture, reasonable risk reduction. It could have been more radar, extended patrols, canceling Sunday leaves. There was enough information that the commanders on the ground could have made these decisions that would have may have mitigated some of the risks. So think about that going forward. And in your papers that are due in a couple of weeks, you have to draw that out. Hint, hint, tap, tap, foot stomp, foot stomp. How could have there been reduction measures based on the intelligence provided? We're going to talk, here's another hint, hint, stomp, stomp. One of your final questions is going to be on the Russian interference in the 2016 election. How come the intel community failed? And I'm going to ask you, where in that chain could reduction measures have been taken that would have prevented a Russian interference campaign, and how that can happen again the next time we have an election? So keep these thoughts in mind going forward. And then the Yom Kippur War. Again, there was over-reliance on HUMIT. Many of you illustrated this. You saw it in the documentary. One single source. There was addiction to preconceived notions. You saw this in the reading with the concept that Egypt wouldn't strike unless they could neutralize the Israeli Air Force on the ground. And then there was a lack of intelligence net assessment. Those first days, as you saw in the video, were a complete surprise to the Israelis. Their assessments were based on tank to tank, aircraft to aircraft. They didn't consider tank anti-tank weapon, aircraft surface to air missile. Those kind of net assessments were lacking, and that's why Israeli planners received such a shock in those first days of the war. So week 4 preview, I'm going to say this out loud. It is a lot of work this week, a lot of reading. And I'll talk about that in a second. The 2 case studies are Iraq WMD and 9/11. You would do best by doing the Iraq WMD readings and documentaries and lectures, and answering the question on Iraq WMD, and then going back and then doing the 9/11 case study. In the discussion section for the Iraq WMD, I bring this up when I say, and I'll change this, when we're talking about what errors were made, I want errors in the intelligence community made in the run-up to the Iraq WMD case. What do you think specifically they made? And some readings, again, the Rachel Maddow talks about politicization of intelligence pretty well. Take Rachel Maddow with a grain of salt, because she's a very political commentator, but I think her documentary is for the most part accurate. 60 Minutes, Curveball, we'll talk about Iraq WMD. There's a committee report, Senate Select Committee on Iraq WMD. It's 200 pages. Don't read 200 pages. It is broken down into highlights, into blue boxes, and you can read those blue boxes, and then if you want to go in detail, you can read the information behind the blue boxes. But don't read 200 pages for this week. Just make sure you kind of focus on those top line blue boxes. And then you have my lectures. And then the 9/11 case study. So the National Geographic, thanks to Disney Plus coming out, they took it offline. I'm going to see if I could find a copy of it anywhere. You might have to go through Amazon or Amazon Prime to actually get it. But just keep that in mind going forward. And then the Nova NSA is on YouTube, and I send the link. And then the readings, the Dahl, and the 9/11 Commission. So make sure, again, you do the Iraq WMD, then do the 9/11 pieces, and then the Sharma lectures. So if there's questions or issues, let me know, and I look forward to this week's discussion.